Good afternoon. I'm Deena Mansour, Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. Thank you for joining us today on an issue of critical importance, racism at a time of pandemic. The Mansfield Center fosters globally minded leaders of integrity with a focus on international engagement and ethics in public affairs. It is critical that at times of crisis, we provide a forum to discuss issues of importance to our community. People of Asian heritage have been subject to incidents of racism, not just across the country, but here in Missoula as well. At the same time, foreigners in China have been subject to racism in connection to the pandemic. We are honored to feature multiple perspectives today, and I will introduce each speaker immediately prior to their segment. Participants may enter questions in the chat box at any time throughout the discussion. Those questions are viewable only by the hosts, and we will pose as many questions as possible following the final speaker. I'm first honored to introduce University of Montana President Seth Bodnar. We're fortunate to have him with us as our leader during this time of crisis. Tasked by Governor Bullock as one of the critical statewide leaders to help manage the pandemic, President Bodnar draws on his prior experience as a senior executive at General Electric, as well as a member of the Army's elite Green Beret, to lead our university. President Bodnar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Stressful time for people all around the globe as we collectively battle a microscopic opponent, a virus that has upended our society in fundamental ways. And it's frankly unfortunate that during a time period already marked by loss and uncertainty and great fear and tension that we need to join together today to discuss a concurrent increase in racism. But this is the reality of the current climate. And I'm deeply grateful to the Mansfield Center for organizing this important dialogue and for all of you for joining to take part in a really, really important discussion. I was asked to speak today about UM's commitment to addressing bias, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Here at UM, we place a tremendous value on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's very important for us, fundamentally important for us, to not just recognize but celebrate the differences among us and to respect the dignity and the rights of all persons. I recently shared a statement with our University of Montana community articulating that discrimination and harassment of any kind do not align with our UM values. In this statement, I voiced that it is our duty to ensure that members of our UM family and our broader community feel safe. We are an institution that celebrates discourse in the free exchange of informed ideas. And obviously as a public institution, we celebrate, we honor the First Amendment and freedom of speech here on campus. That said, we always have and always will continue to actively oppose intolerance and hate. And we do this in multiple ways, through the coursework and programming we offer, as well as numerous groups on campus, including our Diversity Advisory Council, our Women's Leadership Initiative, and organizations like the Mansfield Center. We are constantly seeking to improve the inclusivity here on our campus. And it's really important as an institution of higher education that we acknowledge, that we always remember we are here to educate. We're here to advance the reaches of knowledge through research. We are about nurturing and fostering inclusive prosperity and frankly shaping that informed and educated citizenry that is, as our founders said, the bulwark of the Republic. And fundamental to our ability to do this is the assurance that people feel supported in expressing their views and that they feel free to explore their thoughts, their ideas. But in a culture that is marked by fear or intolerance or hatred, that fundamentally important work, not just of our community or our state, but frankly this republic, is impossible. And that's why sessions like today and a continued commitment to a culture of inclusion is so important to the effective operations and our ability to achieve our critically important role for society. So I want to, again, thank Deena and the Mansfield Center and all of our panelists today. This is such an important conversation. I'm so grateful for your leadership on this front, and really excited to have such a great group of smart, passionate individuals taking part today. So thank you, everybody.
President Bodnar, thank you so much for joining us today. We know that you have been working countless hours a day to address this crisis in the best interests of our community and our state, and it really means so much to us and our community that you care so much about this issue. So thank you again. Next, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Nicky Phear. She's the Academic Director for the Mansfield Center's Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. She runs the Women's Leadership Initiative for the University of Montana and facilitates storytelling in her teaching and community outreach. Thank you for joining us, Nicky.
Thank you, Deena. As the COVID-19 pandemic escalates in the US, people of Asian heritage have increasingly been subject to incidents of racism, including acts of discrimination and harassment. What follows is a small sample of stories from Missoula community members shared anonymously. We hope these stories will raise awareness about racism and the resulting feelings of fear and insecurity that will help us to build support and solidarity with our Asian friends. Story one is from a faculty member at the University of Montana. Here are her words. My heart sank rapidly when I watched the news with disbelief that President Trump called COVID-19 a Chinese virus. Immediately, I started to worry how some people will take this message and blame Chinese Americans for all the issues related to the virus. When I started hearing stories from my Chinese friends on the East Coast and the West Coast about how they got spat on and yelled at by strangers on their way to work or in grocery stores. Accusations also happen to other Asian Americans. For example, a Texas man stabbed an Asian American family, including 2 children, ages 2 and 6, because he thought the family was Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. Unfortunately, I also hear stories from my Chinese and Asian friends here in Missoula about incidents where they were treated unfriendly due to their Asian identities. With Phear, I've put extra effort to minimize my Asian look. When my family and I are in public spaces, such as having a walk in the neighborhood, we wear hats or hoods and minimize talking in our native language. Weeks before Montanans started the stay-at-home status, my family and lots of my Chinese friends had already decided to stay at home as much as possible because we fear the virus spread and we fear the potential harm by other people based on our identities. I have been living in Missoula for many years and I love our community. It's understandable that people get stressed, panicked, angry, sad, etc. during this pandemic. However, please do not put the blame onto the Chinese and Asian Americans who are impacted by the virus just like everyone else. Story 2 is based on the experience of 2 Chinese women. One of them immigrated to the US 2 years ago and has been living in Missoula since then. The other came to the country last fall before any COVID-19 cases were identified in China. Here is what they said. We love going to the swimming pool and sauna room at a gym here in Missoula. One day last December, we went there again. There were quite a few people swimming in the pool. When we entered the sauna, there were 3 people. A lady came in to ask where we were from. After informing her that we were from China, she asked when we entered the US. We immediately realized that she probably had heard the news about the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan and was nervous that we may have had the virus. We told her that we've been living in Missoula for quite a while and we didn't have the virus. She nodded and left. We then turned our attention to close our eyes and did meditation. After 3 to 5 minutes, we realized that everyone else had left the sauna. With an odd feeling, we decided to check out the swimming pool. No one remained in the pool either. For me, hearing these stories helps me understand the impact of Asian American biases and how discrimination is felt and internalized by those who experience it. Hearing these stories makes me want to be a better friend and stand in solidarity with our Asian American friends who enrich our community and our nation.
Nicky, thank you for sharing these stories and reinforcing that racism happens right here at home in a community that we consider loving and supportive and working with one another. At the same time, racism is across the world at this time. There have been stories of foreigners in China that have been subject to racism as a result of this pandemic. So we'll turn now to Dr. Terry Weidner, a professor emeritus of Chinese politics and a Mansfield fellow at the University of Montana.
Thank you, Deena, and thanks to the Mansfield Center for putting on this program. You know, some Chinese friends were very concerned that I would perceive my role as coming in and trash China, and that is not what I'm going to do. But I will say that, as was noted in a perceptive New York Times op-ed the other day, gauging real sentiment in an autocratic society is very difficult, right? We see everything that's going on in China through a filter. But I will say that having heard from several American friends who live in China currently, that the reports we receive in the media seem to be pretty consistent. There is anti-American and anti-foreign behavior in China, and particularly focused these days on Africans, in large part because there is some racism in China, but also because they are most easily spotted as non-Chinese, right? From what I've heard, the behavior does not include the more despicable incidents of spitting on foreigners or beating them that we've seen someplace in the United States, but situations where foreigners are excluded from restaurants, where entire buses or subway cars are abandoned when a foreigner gets on, or where foreigners have been forbidden to enter housing complexes where they've lived long-term and are known. This bias then clearly has some official basis. Having said that, as someone who's lived in China and traveled there for low 50 years, I have absolutely no doubt that the vast majority of Chinese are just like us, sane, basically kind, and people who want to do the right thing. Like us, though, they're also flawed, and thus love a good conspiracy theory and give in to the temptation, especially in a time of fear and uncertainty, to blame others. I don't know if any of you saw the other day, I think in the Washington Post, there was a featured article about contemporaneous accounts of plagues in 17th century Europe. And the consistent aspect of all of them was looking for someone to blame for the pain and suffering, and especially the tendency to blame outsiders for the misery. But what is different today, obviously, and deeply troubling in my mind, is that the role that our leaders have played in validating behavior that reflects our basest instincts. I was never a fan of George W. Bush, I must confess, but when 9/11 occurred and he immediately came out and admonished Americans that those Muslims are not all Muslims, he met a standard of decency, of leadership, that have been sorely lacking, I think, at both Mr. Trump and in Chinese Party Secretary Xi Jinping. Part of the failure is probably personal on both accounts. Both have giant egos, an intolerance of any criticism, and a reflective tendency to deflect blame by shifting it onto others. And we know how President Trump reacted, but I think you also may know that Party Secretary Xi also stumbled badly at the beginning of the outbreak of the virus in China, suppressing medical warnings about it, And fully 2 weeks after hearing a high-level intelligence briefing about the dangers of the virus, allowing local officials in Wuhan to gather 40,000 people for a potluck dinner. So it's clear that there is blame to be had. And I think that the blame was sufficient that despite China's draconian control of media, of the internet, and other aspects of social organization in China, this blame was perceived very clearly by Chinese citizens who defied the authorities to voice not just concern for the victims in Wuhan and admiration for the doctor who was the chief whistleblower, but also blame for the party for letting this happen and covering it up. So in response, feeling under enormous pressure at a time when he is intolerant of any opposition whatsoever, Xi Jinping sent out a foreign ministry spokesman to blame the United States. To do it at this level is more than Trump saying, well, I don't know, but people are saying, and I heard this, and I don't know, but, so it was done at an official level and quite calculated. And since then, they blame the Italians and others. And as a backup, now they have done a full court press using China's extensive propaganda machine to rewrite the story completely, that it was Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party who not only heroically reacted to detect, but to suppress the virus. And instead, they're turning their blame, picking up American media pieces critical of Trump with Chinese subtitles, and trying to cast the United States as a pathetic country who can send healthcare workers out covered with garbage bags and letting their old people die in stacks in retirement homes. And trying to create an us versus them, we are civilized, what's wrong with those people kind of message. And the suppression of any truth includes Chinese as well. You may have read, there's a blogger in Wuhan named Fang Fang, real name Wang Fang, who simply wrote about her own struggles facing the crisis and her empathy for others in the city and what they'd gone through. And she has been subjected to a litany of attacks from young patriots, pink warriors who support the party in China unerringly, and she's been called an enemy of the people because her story has been picked up in English. So where does this lead us? I don't know. I mean, I think that although it didn't work that well in 2016, we might try Michelle Obama's approach of they go low, but we stay high, right? And it's very hard to do when our worst behavior is being validated by our top leadership. I do think there's a strategic aspect to this that may be sort of corrective on the Chinese side. China has tried to shop itself and its ideology and its approach as an alternative system to the United States. Not only are they more efficient, but they represent a sort of civilized approach to global issues that the United States does not. And the racist incidents, especially against Africans, has really undercut Chinese prestige. And others are also troubled by the fact that a lot of equipment sent by China as goodwill gesture has turned out to be faulty. But I think that kind of pressure may lead Xi Jinping to cool his jets and to try and act in a more, which I say, benevolent way. In contrast, though, there's growing evidence that President Trump is going to use anti-Chinese sentiment as a key part of his re-election campaign. Blaming them for the virus on top of trade wars, and on, it fits in with anti-Bush sentiment because the son was involved. Anyway, if this is the case, I guess the best we can hope for is that sanity prevails, and that in the meantime, we all have to do everything we can to appeal to the better nature and to show people what Americans really stand for. So thank you, Deena.
Thank you, Terry. Next, we have Helen Xia, a writer, activist, and Fulbright scholar. Her latest book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, chronicles the 70-year exodus from Mao's revolution. The daughter of immigrants from China, Helen was born and raised in New Jersey. Her activism in the 1980s landmark civil rights case of anti-Asian violence is featured in the Oscar-nominated documentary, Who Killed Vincent Chin? Helen is a graduate of Princeton University's first coeducational class and holds honorary degrees from the University of San Francisco and the City University of New York Law School. She attended medical school for 2 years, then worked as a construction laborer, an auto worker, and a community organizer, after which she discovered her life's work as writer. Helen, thank you so much for joining us during this conversation in Montana.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mansour, for having me, and thank you for the Mansfield Center for putting on this very, very important discussion. I'm just honored to be here with all of you. And let me just start out saying that, that as you point out, I am an American-born Chinese. I feel that I do want to talk a little bit about what Dr. Weidner just said, but because we could really look at any country in the world right now and see that their response to the COVID threat has been woefully inadequate, and most of the governments have been blaming other people. And unfortunately, this pandemic of foreign people, basically xenophobia and racism and violence is going on all over the world. So I do want to say, yes, I was born and raised in New Jersey. I'm American born. My latest book is about the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution, and my book is banned in China in hard copy. So I'm unfortunately also very familiar with the things that Dr. Weidner was talking about. And I do want to say that, you know, what Dr. Phear was saying on the incidents that are going on in Montana are very, very concerning and unfortunately very reflective of what's going on, not only in the country, but as part of a global pandemic of racism toward anybody who looks Chinese. And some of the things that Dr. Weidner was talking about are, you know, given as reasons or justification as to why people who look Chinese should be blamed. But for Chinese in America, most are like me. I mean, we are Americans, and we had nothing to do with you know, the rise of this virus, but we have been, we do see the rise of this really hatred and incidents of violence throughout the country. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And I would also say that it would be a sad takeaway in looking at, you know, the racism that exists within China or the faults of their leadership and their totalitarian system, if the takeaway from hearing that would be as though there is a false equivalence to say that, well, they're doing it and look at all the bad things they're doing, so whatever we do here, why not do the same? We're all the same, so yes, let's express our racism. And certainly we know, as far as you know, racism toward Africans, African Americans, we have nothing to brag about in the United States. And in fact, with the COVID virus, we're seeing you know, a terrible toll being taken on African American communities, of immigrant communities, certainly of the Native American population. And so, so these are things I think we should all be alert for, and to see that these aren't good things. These aren't things to say, yes, let's do it to other people. So I just wanted to start with that. And to say that, so we are seeing that the COVID pandemic of the virus is also leading to a pandemic of racist and xenophobic attacks around the world. And, the anti-Chinese, anti-Asian attacks are taking place, yes, in the United States. Dr. Phear mentioned, when the terrible attack that has taken place in Texas, where in a Sam's Club, a family of that is Burmese American was attacked by a man who was so angry that they might be spreading the virus and stabbed a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. And the FBI has already labeled this as a hate crime. But incidents like that are going on around the country. A woman in New York had acid thrown on her face. There's a murder that's being investigated right now in Alabama that is believed to be related to anti-Chinese or anti-Asian racism because of the virus. And these are just a few. So after the national emergency was declared and different states were put into sheltering, there were 3 different organizations, community organizations, advocacy groups, nonprofits that set up reporting hotlines because it was very clear that people were self-reporting and saying that, I'm afraid to walk out. This is happening to me. I went to the grocery store and my children are being attacked. And so they set up reporting lines, and just one of them reported in the first week of operation in March, almost 700 reports. By the next week, they had more than 1,000. And as of today, they have more than 1,600. And I've given a slide for anybody who wants to report anything, whether you experienced it or you witnessed some discriminatory or bullying or harassment or physical attack, that there are websites that you can go to. And I've given those, but one is Stop AAPI Hate. And in any case, we're seeing that these are not trivial numbers. These are self-reported, more than 1,600 at this point. And we know that most people don't report. So this is a undercount for sure, but it's a clear spike. And whenever there is, unfortunately, kind of aiding, abetting, and inciting this, as even from the White House, that number spikes up. There are unfortunately people who are suffering, who are frustrated, and who are angry and looking for people to blame. So this is something that goes on. And what have those the data shown already? Well, that the majority of people who have experienced these attacks are not even of Chinese descent. It's basically a lumping together of all Asians in America, of anybody who might look Chinese. And so those are the majority of the attacks. There are videos of elderly seniors who are being, who are running through the streets because they're being chased and having things sprayed on them. There are reports of children being beaten up and sent to the hospital. And so also a high proportion in the data is that women, Asian women, are being attacked or bullied or cursed at. And so, this is not only harassment, it is pretty typical of bullying behavior as well. And so there's a whole range of aggression that's happened, even leading up to killing and death. And so what we see here now is a sort of compound double jeopardy for Asian Americans who, as Americans, are also under lockdown, also fearing catching the virus, and are catching the virus and dying from it. And then also having to be afraid of the pandemic of racism that's going on. And so this is really not only something that is frightening for Asians in America, but it also does nothing for all Americans, because about 1 in 5 healthcare workers in America is an immigrant, and many of them are Asian American. And what that means is we're hearing reports of doctors, nurses, home caregivers, people who are essential workers, first responders on their way to save maybe somebody's family's life and who are being attacked on the way to treat other people and put themselves at risk doing that. So there have been a number of reports that even our first responder Asian Americans are afraid to go to work. And this doesn't help anybody. So I do want to also just give a little bit of background perspective here too. Asian Americans are especially worried because we've seen this before. This is not new in American history, and certainly for Montanans, you know, how the West was won took place with a lot of ethnic cleansing that of course included Native Americans and Latinx people and Asians in America. So one thing that I thought, especially in Montana, people would be interested in knowing is that during the late 1800s, there was a great ethnic cleansing and what was called the driving out of Asians in America, particularly Chinese. And so Missoula's close to Idaho. Idaho at one point had a majority population of Chinese. And why were there so many Chinese in Idaho? Because they were miners and they had gone to Idaho to mine. And so at one point in the census of Idaho, a very large portion of the population in Idaho were Chinese. And that changed with this ethnic cleansing in the late 1800s that the Chinese Exclusion Act was part of to get rid of all Chinese out of America. And that getting rid of was not only a federal law to ban all Chinese from America, but also included lynchings, massacres, the burnings of Chinatowns in Denver, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, in locations all through the West. So that's one reason why the population of the Western United States and the entire United States changed very drastically. And, you know, it's important to remember that one of the reasons that this ethnic cleansing and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which then was later extended to all Asians, all people from Asia, were eventually banned and not permitted to become citizens of the United States. One reason was that was a period of economic depression, recession, people out of work. And who did they blame then? As Dr. Weidner was saying, people needed to blame somebody. They blamed the Chinese, they blamed the Asians. And we don't even have to look as far as the 1800s. In the 1980s, there was also an economic depression in the United States when a young man named Vincent Chin in Detroit was killed after the auto industry collapsed. The auto industry, major manufacturing part of America, every other sector that supported the auto industry also collapsed. And throughout the Midwest, there was a terrible depression that eventually became a recession for the rest of the country. And a young man who was Chinese American was blamed because he looked Japanese. And much as we see today with leaders across the world, even in our White House, blaming people of another country, back then in the 1980s, it was the country of Japan that was blamed for the collapse of the US auto industry and why nobody wanted to buy a Detroit-made dinosaur that got only 7 or 8 miles a gallon. And so instead of blaming Germany and Volkswagen, Japan and Japanese-made cars were to blame. Anybody who drove a Japanese-made car could be shot at on the freeway, and anybody who was of East Asian appearance was a moving target. And sadly, a young man named Vincent Chin, who was out celebrating his bachelor party, was killed because he looked Japanese. That actually became a landmark civil rights case of Asian Americans coming together to stand up against this terrible climate of hate. But I have to say, sadly, during that economic depression, he was not the only victim of hate crime. And so there are many, many cases of that, but a pregnant woman, Asian woman, was pushed in front of a subway train in New York City by a man who said he was afraid of Asian people. Children in a schoolyard were killed by a man with an assault weapon. The school was primarily Southeast Asian, Cambodian refugee children. It was an elementary school. He took his assault weapon and shot into the schoolyard, killing a number of 8-year-old children and teachers. And why I mentioned these, and there are many others, but the first reaction of the police and authorities was, oh, this has nothing to do with prejudice or hate. And so basically denial. And so I mentioned that the organizations that are collecting these incidents of hate, these are nonprofits, these are community organizations. And while they were collecting 100 reports a day, the chief of police of San Francisco said, oh, we haven't received a single report. And so I think it's significant to note that Dr. Phear was recounting the incidents happening in Montana. And many people are afraid to go to the authorities. They might be accused of visa violations. They might be accused of any number of other things that prevent people from feeling like they can go to the police. And chief among those is the idea that the police are not going to take them seriously. And so unfortunately we see that. And that's why I'm especially, I think it's especially terrific that the Mansfield Center and the University of Montana are doing something about this. I would also like to just give a shout out to Stephen Levine, whose excellent op-ed piece in the Missoulian appeared, and he also connected the other times in our history when 120,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up and accused of being the enemy. And this is what happens when we have the language of war as well. So, so our Surgeon General has said that this COVID-19 threat is our Pearl Harbor, our 9/11. Well, what happens when we talk in the language of war? Like Japan was our enemy. We see higher incidents of hate crimes, of attacks, because when we're at war, there is an enemy. And what do you do with an enemy? You kill the enemy. So there is much more to say about this. I think there are resources that people can find online, and I've given a couple of websites, but I would just like to end by saying that we can actually come together and make positive change and do things that will make us stronger against this virus, against the COVID-19. Many of the researchers, medical researchers, STEM researchers who are looking for a vaccine are also Asian American. And so by coming together and standing up and being good allies, we can also not only make the world safe for them, but it also comes back to us too, because if they're able to do their work, whether as first responders or as researchers or people in our community, our teachers, our neighbors, we can be stronger in tackling any difficulties. So I would just urge everybody to educate ourselves, educate others, use our networks to come together. And that's how we are going to defeat this virus. So thank you for letting me share some of that with you.
Helen, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us, and truly a national and historic perspective. And thanks also for referencing Steve Levine's op-ed that did run in 4 newspapers across the state. And we're so grateful for our local media for allowing us to use this as a platform and for the great work that they've done in terms of shining a light on what's been happening in this pandemic. And also a shout out to the National Council on U.S.-China Relations who first connected us with Helen. I think they're on as well today, so thank you for your work. Next, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Tobin Shearer. He is a history professor and director of African American Studies here at the University of Montana, as well as a Montana University System teaching scholar. Tobin, thanks for joining us.
Very welcome. It's great to be here this afternoon. And I'd like to simply say how honored I am to be part of such a great group of activists and scholars. I've learned a lot already just listening to my colleagues speak. And I'm also encouraged by the number of you who have joined us and indicated your interest in addressing this really important problem. What I've agreed to do at this point is offer ideas about how to respond to the current resurgence of racism in this country toward the Asian American community. My comments build on the work of researchers and activists across the country and thus reflect an emerging consensus about how to remain true to the principles of democracy and inclusion that this country has long said it stands for, but has frequently failed to embody. First, we need to understand the larger context of efforts to dismantle US racism. Whenever I'm asked how to respond to overt racism within this country's context, I first start by saying that we need to deal with both overt and covert racism. To put it simply, the former creates the conditions that make the latter possible. In other words, whenever white nationalists rear their heads, our response often imply that they embody the entirety of the problem of racism. If we defeat them, we think, then we've defeated all racism. But white nationalists do as much damage by seeming to encompass the problem as they do by the hate crimes themselves. If all we do is respond to white nationalists, then the deep-seated institutional inequities in this country that consistently privilege members of the white community and disadvantage and oppress people of color remain unacknowledged and unaddressed. So rather than just respond to white nationalists, or to the many less well-organized instances of personal prejudice and microaggressions that reflect the same message, we need to respond to both overt and covert expressions of racism. The reality is that in this time of COVID-19, some of those more covert forms of racism are becoming glaringly visible. As we've already noted, recent headlines have indicated that the Navajo Nation has lost more lives to COVID-19 than 13 states combined, that more than 65% of Hispanics have lost their jobs or suffered a significant reduction in their incomes as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and that Black New Yorkers are dying at twice the rate of their white peers. The necessary and urgent response to the specific instances of anti-Asian American racism that we are discussing here today needs to be addressed in concert with correcting the healthcare inequities that lead to these systemic injustices. And so, here are a half dozen ideas on how to be part of the solution. Start with the history. Acknowledge and understand the history of anti-Asian racism as our speaker just described here in the US. Adrian De Leon, an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, has noted the ways in which Asian Americans have long been considered a threat to a nation that promoted a whites-only immigration policy. He adds they were called a quote-unquote yellow peril, unclean and unfit for citizenship in America. This took the form of 19th century propaganda about the uncleanliness of the San Francisco Chinese community that in turn helped bring about the passage, as already mentioned, of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Acts. And during World War II, this country incarcerated Japanese Americans, many of whom were not only naturalized US citizens, but even second and third generation Americans. That history of anti-Asian American racism has indeed ebbed and flowed in the 20th century, but never disappeared. What we are seeing now is not an exception to that history, but a continuation of it. Number two, reflect public health officials' language. Reject and oppose, as we've said already, the use of racist language that places blame on a specific group or country for the COVID-19 outbreak. Instead, as journalist Danielle Kwan suggests, use the language that is used by scientists and public health officials. To put it bluntly, refer to COVID-19, not the Chinese virus. Number 3, equip yourself to interrupt. The Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance program promotes a 4-step process for speaking up in the face of racism. They describe in detail how to interrupt, question, educate, and echo. Their website has much more information. Over the years, I've found that members of the white community find the process of interrupting racism very challenging. For those of us who are white, this is some of the most important work that we have to do. We have an opportunity to make a difference with our friends, family, and coworkers. When they use racist language or make racist assumptions, we can invite new learning and growth. Why not take time during quarantine and shelter in place to practice interrupting racism? In this way, we can join efforts to slow the spread of racism, just like we're joining efforts to slow the spread of COVID-19. Number 4, document and report. In cases of overt hate crimes, after tending to victims, alerting healthcare workers, and calling the police, document the event by taking pictures and writing down details. In so doing, refrain from touching any evidence. If necessary, insist that the police designate the action a hate crime. The Japanese American Citizens League offers more detail in their When Hate Hits You, an Asian Pacific American Hate Crime Response Guide. Number 5, call for a coordinated federal response. As of this point, neither the Center for Disease Control and Prevention or the Justice Department has initiated a plan to stop the further targeting of Asian Americans. Measures were put in place to protect other targeted groups in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and following the severe acute respiratory syndrome outbreak, that is the SARS outbreak of 2003. Contact your federal representatives asking for just such a coordinated federal response at this time. Number 6, contribute to Asian American and Pacific Islander nonprofits and businesses. The Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the AALDEF, and the Mansfield Center are just 2 of many organizations working to support the rights and contributions of the Asian American community. The Montana Racial Equity Project, the Montana Human Rights Network, and Missoula's Idea for Racial Justice are also on the front lines of work against racism and prejudice in our state and need our support as well. A closing anecdote. During one of the most difficult moments of the civil rights movement, after assassins had murdered both Malcolm X in 1965 and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, longtime civil rights organizer Ella Baker made a decision. She had long ago proclaimed that strong people don't need strong leaders because she was convinced that they could be strong on their own. So rather than be immobilized by the loss of charismatic leaders, she just kept organizing and opposing racism with other strong people. She did so for the next 2 decades as she supported groups like the Third World Women's Alliance and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She remained active and involved up until her 83rd birthday, the day she passed on. She's left us with an example of strength and fortitude. In the midst of this pandemic, may we all be given the strength to respond with courage and proactivity, just like Miss Ella Baker. Thanks again for joining us today.
And Tobin, thank you so much. We are so fortunate to have Tobin with us here at the University of Montana, and one of our foremost experts in terms of acting against discrimination. So we have about 10 minutes left. We're going to turn to the questions. I encourage people again to put your questions in the chat box. We have had a number of questions, so I'm going to start off for one for Helen. There was a comment that there was a concern about Dr. Weidner's comments that his logic appeared to be China's leadership has this problem and there's racism in China, so America's behaviors are okay. I don't believe that that was Dr. Weidner's message at all. I think he was just pointing to the fact that we do have issues of racism on both sides. And Helen, I liked very much how you emphasized the issue of how this doesn't make it right. And Helen, I wonder if you could speak a bit more to that point about the fact that it's not justifiable as a result.
Well, I think what we are seeing worldwide is that governments communities, systems are completely under stress. And it is a pretty standard political move for political leaders anywhere to try to deflect blame. And I think, you know, those who watch the news and all the talk shows here in the US, we can see that there's a lot of comments about how that's happening right here in this country on whether getting test swabs and things like that. And certainly I don't know. I think Dr. Weidner knows better what's going specifically on in China, but I would dare say that any government we look at this time is doing the same thing. And that's what we need to be as human beings, as citizens of our own communities, that we need to realize that this is not something that's going to be helpful to solving the problems. If our leaders are too busy blaming other people, where's the attention going on to bring people together, to actually solve our common problems? And as has been said all over the world, this global pandemic, the virus doesn't know any boundaries. And so, the last thing we want to do is to put up walls between us and other countries and the research they're doing and the experiences they're having, how we can work through our travels back and forth once that begins again with airlines and shipping and all that stuff and movements. So that can only happen if we work together as people, as countries, as governments, as communities, and on our community levels too, not to create barriers within our own communities. So we don't want what's going on with these different governments to become a microcosm in our own, you know, with our neighbors, with the next town over. So I think that's what I would take away from that whole sad scenario of thinking about what's going on with the leaders of China, or the leaders here, or the leaders anywhere else. It's I think what we're finding is we're going to have to look to ourselves and our communities for leadership that we can give that will bring people together. And that's the only way we're going to solve the problems that we all have now.
Thank you, Helen. And I have a couple of follow-up questions for you, but I see Terry leaning forward. So let me go to Terry now. Terry, you're muted.
Myself. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that I talked only about the Chinese side because that was my assignment. My daughter is from China. I could go on for 40 or 50 minutes about what I see as the poor sense of leadership on the issue of race and discrimination in the United States. So I would just underscore everything that Helen said, that this is not a China thing or a US thing, but I do think that the United States, we're supposed to stand for something that maybe, I don't believe in American exceptionalism generally, but I do think that we need to set the tone for a very human society. And this is one issue where we need to show some leadership. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Let me pose both of these questions consecutively to Tobin and to Helen. Let's see. How do you personally reach those who are acting in xenophobic or racist ways against persons of Asian descent in this time of fear and anxiety? Tobin suggests interrupting. Are there other tactics? And let me go to the question for Helen, and she could speak directly after Tobin. What are ways to demonstrate solidarity with our Asian American friends and community members, drawing a bit from what you were saying earlier, Helen? So I'll go to Tobin and then Helen.
It's always a question of where we're having our conversations and where we're interacting. Obviously, we're not suggesting that we go out and seek interactions given that the requirements we're facing in terms of quarantine, but at any point in which we are engaging with others in our social circles, on our social media communities, those are the places where we can bring and set standards of engagement that are going to invite growth and challenge racism. I would have a different set of answers if we were not under quarantine, but in this particular situation, it's to use our spheres of influence to be as proactive as we can in addressing and stopping the spread of racism in all its form, but particularly towards the Asian American community at this point.
Yeah, I would just agree with what Tobin just said, and really thought your presentation was terrific, and especially what people can do on the ground if they see, you know, anything that might be threatening or to an Asian American in their community. You know, I think there's a whole range of what this threatening behavior could be, and I would never suggest to somebody to put themselves in harm's way either. There are some, in addition to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there's another group called Holla Back, Holla Back, that has a whole thing about bystander training and what you can do that is, you know, on the one hand, step forward, but on the other hand, to do something afterward and just go to the person who was insulted, spit upon, possibly attacked or threatened, and just say, hey, I saw that, and I want you to know that I thought that was terrible, and how are you, and what can I do to support you? Because many people, as it turns out, who have experienced these things say that the number one thing that they wish had happened was that somebody had acknowledged that, you know, this bad thing happened, and to reach out to them. Yet for most of them, that never happens. And short of that, there are ways to just deflect, you know, to draw somebody else's attention away from what, you know, the target or whatever they have in mind. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the anger or hatred or blaming that it's coming out is from people who are highly frustrated, hurting at home, you know, maybe are trying to figure out how to bring food to their kids that night. And so the whole idea of trying to channel that anger, channel that energy in ways that we could actually solve these problems too, to, you know, get food from the farm that's wasting away to the tables of where people are hungry, or find constructive ways and to say, look, instead of attacking people, let's see how we can really solve the problems that are really hurting all of us. And I hope that would take some of that negative energy and turn it into something positive for everybody.
Helen, thank you so much. We have so many questions and really only a minute left. Before I close, Tobin, do you want to share a bit about your project that will be archived by the University of Montana and how people can get involved with that as well?
Sure. One of the things that we learned from my own study of the civil rights movement is how important of the sense of vision and hope is. So one of the things I'm doing, also for my own personal benefit, is to invite people to write 19 words of hope. If you look up Hope 19 with my name, Tobin Miller Shearer, you'll be invited to offer your 19 words of hope that will then be archived in the Mansfield Center's archival holdings, and to do so by April 30. Thanks, Deena.
Okay. Great, Tobin. I'm so sorry that we can't address all the questions. We've had such an outpouring of interest from the community. We've had upwards of 180 people participating in this conversation. We will have it archived, recorded on our website on Monday, and this is also being produced by Montana Community Access Television. I'd refer you all to Helen's website, helenxia.com. She also mentioned the Hollaback resource, which we have up on a slide and was entered in our chat box earlier. So this list of resources was developed in concert with Helen and colleagues across the country. And a number of people on this chat have also been contributing additional resources, which we'll review and add as well. So you can find all that information on our website at umt.edu/Mansfield. So in this time when we are told to stay physically apart, it's essential that we all come together by embracing the spirit of our common humanity. So I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. And on behalf of our panelists and the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, thank you all for joining the conversation. Goodbye.